Chapter 15 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 2, As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 15. That's the Question.
How many times has he seen you?
Twice.
So that he knows your face and figure?
I'm afraid so. He cannot help remembering the man who faced him in his own room.
That's unfortunate.
Damned unfortunate, but one must expect some sort of a handicap in a game like this. Before I'm done with him, he'll look me full in the face and wonder if he's ever seen me before. I wasn't always a detective. I was a carpenter once, as you know, and I'll take to the tools again. As soon as I'm handy with them, I'll hunt up lodgings in Hicks Street. He may suspect me at first, but he won't long. I'll be such a confounded good workman. I only wish I hadn't such pronounced features. They've stood awfully in my way, Mr. Gryce. I don't like to talk about my appearance, but I'm so confounded plain that people remember me. Why couldn't I have had one of those putty faces which don't mean anything? It would have been a deuced sight more convenient.
You've done very well as it is.
But I want to do better. I want to deceive him to his face. He's clever, this same Brotherson, and there's glory to be got in making a fool of him. Do you think it could be done with a beard? I've never worn a beard. While I'm settling back into my old trade, I can let the hair grow.
Do. It'll make you look as weak as water. It'll be blonde, of course.
And silky and straggling. Charming addition to my beauty. But it'll take half an inch off my nose, and it'll cover my mouth, which means a lot in my case. Then my complexion. It must be changed naturally. I'll consult a doctor about that. No sort of make-believe will go with this man. If my eyes look weak, they must really be so. If I walk slowly and speak huskily, it must be because I cannot help it. I can bear the slight inconvenience of temporary ill health in a cause like this, and, if necessary, the cough will be real and the headache positive.
Sweetwater, we'd better give the task to another man, to someone Brotherson has never seen and won't be suspicious of.
He'll be suspicious of everybody who tries to make friends with him now, only a little more so with me, that's all. But I've got to meet that, and I'll do it by being, temporarily of course, exactly the man I seem. My health will be not good for the next few weeks, I'm sure of that. But I'll be a model workman, neat and conscientious, with just a suspicion of dash where dash is needed. He knows the real thing when he sees it, and there's not a fellow living more alive to shams. I won't be a sham. I'll be it. You'll see.
But the doubt. Can you do all this in doubt of the issue?
No, I must have confidence in the end, and I must believe in his guilt. Nothing else will carry me through. I must believe in his guilt.
Yes, that's essential.
And I do. I never was surer of anything than I am of that. But I'll have the deuce of a time to get evidence enough for a grand jury. That's plainly to be seen, and that's why I'm so dead set on the business. It's such an even toss-up.
I don't call it even. He's got the start of you every way. You can't go to his tenement. The janitor there would recognize you, even if he didn't.
Now I will give you a piece of good news. They're to have a new janitor next week. I learned that yesterday. The present one is too easy. He'll be out long before I'm ready to show myself there, and so will the woman who took care of the poor washerwoman's little child. I'd not have risked her curiosity. Luck isn't all against us. How does Mr. Challoner feel about it?
Not very confident, but willing to give you any amount of rope. Sweetwater, he let me have a batch of letters written by his daughter, which he found in a secret drawer. They are not to be read or even opened unless a great necessity arises. They were written for Brotherson's eye, or so the father says, but she never sent them, too exuberant perhaps. If you ever want them, I cannot give them to you tonight, and wouldn't if I could. Don't go to Mr. Challoner. You must never be seen at his hotel, and don't come to me, but to the little house in West 29th Street, where they will be kept for you, tied up in a package with your name on it. By the way, what name are you going to work under?
My mother's, Zug.
Good, I'll remember. You can always write or even telephone to 29th Street. I'm in constant communication with them there, and it's quite safe.
Thanks. You're sure the superintendent is with me?
Yes, but not the inspector. He sees nothing but the victim of a strange coincidence in Orlando Brotherson.
Again the scales hang even, but they won't remain so. One side is bound to rise. Which? That is the question, Mr. Gryce. End of chapter 15.
Of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 2, As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 16. Opposed. There was a new tenant in the Hicks Street tenement. He arrived late one afternoon and was shown 2 rooms, one in the rear building and another in the front one. Both were on the 4th floor. He demurred at the former, thought it gloomy, but finally consented to try it. The other, he said, was too expensive. The janitor, new to the business, was not much taken with him and showed it, which seemed to offend the newcomer, who was evidently an irritable fellow owing to ill health. However, they came to terms, as I have said, and the man went away, promising to send in his belongings the next day. He smiled as he said this, and the janitor, who had rarely seen such a change take place in a human face, looked uncomfortable for a moment, and seemed disposed to make some remark about the room they were leaving, but, thinking better of it, locked the door and led the way downstairs. As the prospective tenant followed, he may have noticed, probably did, that the door they had just left was a new one, the only new thing to be seen in the whole shabby place. The next night that door was locked on the inside. The young man had taken possession. As he put away the remnants of a meal he had cooked for himself, he cast a look at his surroundings and imperceptibly sighed. Then he brightened again, and sitting down in his solitary chair, he turned his eyes on the window, which, uncurtained and without shade, stared open-mouthed, as it were, at the opposite wall rising high across the court. In that wall, one window only seemed to interest him, and that was on a level with his own. The shade of this window was up, but there was no light back of it, and so nothing of the interior could be seen. But his eye remained fixed upon it, while his hand, stretched out towards the lamp burning near him, held itself in readiness to lower the light at a minute's notice. Did he see only the opposite wall and that unillumined window? Was there no memory of the time when, in a previous contemplation of those dismal panes, he beheld stretching between them and himself a long, low bench with a plain wooden tub upon it, from which a dripping cloth beat out upon the boards beneath, a dismal note, monotonous as the ticking of a clock? One might judge that such memories were indeed his from the rapid glance he cast behind him at the place where the bed had stood in those days. It was placed differently now. But if he saw, and if he heard these suggestions from the past, he was not less alive to the exactions of the present, for, as his glance flew back across the court, his finger suddenly moved, and the flame it controlled sputtered and went out. At the same instant, the window opposite sprang into view as the lamp was lit within, and for several moments the whole interior remained visible, the books, the work table, the cluttered furniture, and, most interesting of all, its owner and occupant. It was upon the latter that the newcomer fixed his attention, and with an absorption equal to that he saw expressed in the countenance opposite. But his was the absorption of watchfulness, that of the other of introspection. Mr. Brotherson, we will no longer call him Dunn even here where he is known by no other name, had entered the room clad in his heavy overcoat, and, not having taken it off before lighting his lamp, still stood with it on, gazing eagerly down at the model occupying the place of honour on the large central table. He was not touching it, not at this moment, but that his thoughts were with it, that his whole mind was concentrated on it, was evident to the watcher across the court. And as this watcher took in this fact, and noticed the loving care with which the enthusiastic inventor finally put out his finger to rearrange a thread or twirl a wheel, his disappointment found utterance in a sigh which echoed sadly through the dull and cheerless room. Had he expected this stern and self-contained man to show an open indifference to work and the hopes of a lifetime? If so, this was the first of many surprises awaiting him. He was gifted, however, with the patience of an automaton, and continued to watch his fellow tenant as long as the latter's shade remained up. When it fell, he rose and took a few steps up and down, but not with the celerity and precision which usually accompanied his movements. Doubt disturbed his mind, and impeded his activity. He had caught a fair glimpse of Brotherson's face as he approached the window, and though it continued to show abstraction, it equally displayed serenity and a complete satisfaction with the present, if not with the future. Had he mistaken his man after all? Was his instinct, for the first time in his active career, wholly at fault? He had succeeded in getting a glimpse of his quarry in the privacy of his own room, at home with his thoughts and unconscious of any espionage. And how had he found him? Cheerful and natural in all his movements. But the evening was young. Retrospect comes with later and more lonely hours. There will be opportunities yet for studying this impassive countenance under much more telling and productive circumstances than these. He would await these opportunities with cheerful anticipation. Meanwhile, he would keep up the routine watch he had planned for this night. Something might yet occur. At all events, he would have exhausted the situation from this standpoint. And so it came to pass that at an hour when all the other hard-working people in the building were asleep, or at least striving to sleep, these two men still sat at their work, one in the light, the other in the darkness, facing each other, consciously to the one, unconsciously to the other, across the hollow well of the now silent court. 11 o'clock. 12. No change on Brotherson's part or in Brotherson's room, but a decided one in the place where Sweetwater sat. Objects which had been totally indistinguishable even to his penetrating eye could now be seen in the ever-brightening outline. The moon had reached the open space above the court, and he was getting the full benefit of it, but it was a benefit he would have been glad to dispense with. Darkness was like a shield to him. He did not feel quite sure that he wanted this shield removed. With no curtain to the window and no shade, and all this brilliance pouring into the room, he feared the disclosure of his presence there, or, if not that, some effect on his own mind of those memories he was more anxious to see mirrored in another's discomfiture than in his own. Was it to escape any lack of concentration which those same memories might bring, that he rose and stepped to the window? Or was it under one of those involuntary impulses which move us in spite of ourselves to do the very thing our judgment disapproves? No sooner had he approached the sill than Mr. Brotherson's shade flew way up and he too looked out. Their glances met, and for an instant the hardy detective experienced that involuntary stagnation of the blood which follows an inner shock. He felt that he had been recognized. The moonlight lay full upon his face, and the other had seen and known him. Else why the constrained attitude and sudden rigidity observable in this confronting figure with its partially lifted hand? A man like Brotherson makes no pause in any action, however trivial, without a reason. Either he had been transfixed by this glimpse of his enemy on watch, or, daring thought, had seen enough of sepulchral suggestion in the wan face looking back from this fatal window to shake him from his composure and let loose the grinning devil of remorse from its iron prison-house. If so, the movement was a memorable one, and the hazard quite worth while. He had gained nothing. He had been the fool of his own wishes. No one, let alone Brotherson, could have mistaken his face for that of a woman. He had forgotten his newly grown beard. Some other cause must be found for the other's attitude. It savoured of shock, if not fear. If it were fear, then had he roused an emotion which might rebound upon himself in sharp reprisal? Death had been known to strike people standing where he stood, mysterious death of a species quite unrecognizable. What warranty had he that it would not strike him? And now? None. Yet it was Brotherson who moved first. With a shrug of the shoulder plainly visible to the man opposite, he turned away from the window, and without lowering the shade, began gathering up his papers for the night, and later banking up his stove with ashes. Sweetwater, with a breath of decided relief, stepped back and threw himself on the bed. It had really been a trial for him to stand there under the other's eye, though his mind refused to formulate his fear, or to give him any satisfaction when he asked himself what there was in the situation suggestive of death to the woman or harm to himself. Nor did morning light bring counsel, as is usual in similar cases. He felt the mystery more in the hubbub and restless turmoil of the day than in the night's silence and inactivity. He was glad when the stroke of 6 gave him an excuse to leave the room, and gladder yet when in doing so he ran upon an old woman from a neighbouring room, who no sooner saw him than she leered at him and eagerly remarked, "Not much sleep, eh? We didn't think you'd like it. Did you see anything?" Now this gave him the one excuse he wanted. "See anything?" he repeated, apparently with all imaginable innocence. "What do you mean by that?" "Don't you know what happened in that room?" "Don't tell me!" he shouted out. "I don't want to hear any nonsense. I haven't time. I've got to be at the shop at 7, and I don't feel very well. What did happen?" he mumbled, and drawing off, just loud enough for the woman to hear. "Something unpleasant, I'm sure." Then he ran downstairs. At 6:30 he found the janitor. He was to all appearance in a state of great excitement, and he spoke very fast. "I won't stay another night in that room," he loudly declared, breaking in where the family were eating breakfast by lamplight. "I don't want to make any trouble, and I don't want to give my reasons, but that room don't suit me. I'd rather take the dark one you talked about yesterday. Here's the money. Have my things moved today, will ye?" "But your moving out after one night's stay will give that room a bad name," stammered the janitor, rising awkwardly. "There'll be talk, and I won't be able to let that room all winter." "Nonsense! Every man hasn't the nerves I have. You'll let it in a week. But let or not let, I'm going front into the little dark room. I'll get the boss to let me off at 4:30. So that's settled." He waited for no reply and got none, but when he appeared promptly at 4:45 he found his few belongings moved into the middle room on the 4th floor of the front building, which, oddly perhaps, chanced to be next door to the one he had held under watch the night before. The first page of his adventure in the Hicks Street tenement had been turned, and he was ready to start upon another. Chapter 16. Initials only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 2, as seen by Detective Sweetwater, Chapter 17, in which a book plays a leading part. When Mr. Brotherson came in that night, he noticed that the door of the room adjoining his own stood open. He did not hesitate. Making immediately for it, he took a glance inside, then spoke up with a ringing intonation. "Hello! Coming to live in this hole?" The occupant, a young man, evidently a workman and somewhat sickly if one could judge from his complexion, turned around from some tinkering he was engaged in and met the intruder fairly, face to face. If his jaw fell, it seemed to be from admiration. No other emotion could have so lighted his eye as he took in the other's proportions and commanding features. No dress (Brotherson was never seen in any other than the homeliest garb in these days) could make him look common or akin to his surroundings. Whether seen from near or far, his presence always caused surprise, and surprise was what the young man showed as he answered briskly. "Yes, this is to be my castle. Are you the owner of the buildings? If so—" "I am not the owner. I live next door. Haven't I seen you before, young man?" Never was there a more penetrating eye than Orlando Brotherson's. As he asked this question, it took some effort on the part of the other to hold his own and laugh with perfect naturalness as he replied, "If you ever go up Henry Street, it's likely enough that you've seen me not once but many times. I'm the fellow who works at the bench next the window in Schuper's repair shop. Everyone knows me." Audacity often carries the day when subtler means would fail. Brotherson stared at the youth, then ventured another question. "A carpenter, eh?" "Yes, and I'm an A1 man at my job. Excuse my brag, it's my one card of introduction." "I've seen you. I've seen you somewhere else than in Schuper's shop. Do you remember me?" "No, sir. I'm sorry to be impolite, but I don't remember you at all. Won't you sit down? It's not very cheerful, but I'm so glad to get out of the room I was in last night that this looks all right to me. Back there, other building," he whispered. "I didn't know, and took the room which had a window in it, but—" The stop was significant. So was his smile, which had a touch of sickliness in it, as well as humour. But Brotherson was not to be caught. "You slept in the building last night? In the other half, I mean?" "Yes, I slept." The strong lip of the other man curled disdainfully. "I saw you," said he. "You were standing in the window overlooking the court. You were not sleeping then. I suppose you know that a woman died in that room?" "Yes, they told me so this morning." "Was that the first you've heard of it?" "Sure!" The word almost jumped at the questioner. "Do you suppose I'd have taken the room if—" But here the intruder, with a disdainful grunt, turned and went out, disgust in every feature. Plain, unmistakable, downright disgust, and nothing more. This was what gave Sweetwater his second bad night. This and a certain discovery he made. He had counted on hearing what went on in the neighbouring room through the partition running back of his own closet, but he could hear nothing, unless it was the shutting down of a window, a loud sneeze, or the rattling of coals when they were put on the fire. And these possessed no significance. What he wanted was to catch the secret sigh, the muttered word, the involuntary movement. He was too far removed from this man still. How could he manage to get near him, at the door of his mind, of his heart? Sweetwater stared all night from his miserable cot into the darkness of that separating closet, with no result. His task looked hopeless. No wonder that he could get no rest. Next morning he felt ill, but he rose all the same and tried to get his own breakfast. He had but partially succeeded, and was sitting on the edge of his bed in wretched discomfort, when the very man he was thinking of appeared at his door. "I have come to see how you are," said Brotherson. "I noticed that you did not look well last night. Won't you come in and share my pot of coffee?" "I can't eat," mumbled Sweetwater, for once in his life thrown completely off his balance. "You're very kind, but I'll manage all right. I'd rather. I'm not quite dressed, you see, and I must go to the shop." Then he thought, "What an opportunity I'm missing. Have I any right to turn tail because he plays his game from the outset with trumps? No, I have a small trump somewhere about me to lay on this trick. It isn't an ace, but it'll show I'm not chicane." And, smiling, though not with his usual cheerfulness, Sweetwater added, "Is the coffee all made? I might take a drop of that, but you mustn't ask me to eat. I just couldn't." "Yes, the coffee is made, and it isn't bad either. You'd better put on your coat. The hall's draughty." And waiting till Sweetwater did so, he led the way back to his own room. Brotherson's manner expressed perfect ease. Sweetwater's not. He knew himself changed in looks, in bearing, in feeling even, but was he changed enough to deceive this man on the very spot where they had confronted each other a few days before in a keen moral struggle? The looking glass he passed on his way to the table where the simple breakfast was spread out showed him a figure so unlike the alert, businesslike chap he had been that night, that he felt his old assurance revive in time to ease a situation which had no counterpart in his experience. "I'm going out myself today, so we'll have to hurry a bit," was Brotherson's first remark as they seated themselves at the table. "Do you like your coffee plain or with milk in it?" "Plain? Gosh, what pictures! Where do you get 'em? You must have a lot of coin." Sweetwater was staring at the row of photographs, mostly of a very high order, tacked along the wall separating the two rooms. They were unframed, but they were mostly copies of great pictures, and the effect was rather imposing in contrast to the shabby furniture and the otherwise homely fittings. "Yes, I've enough for that kind of thing," was his host's reply. But the tone was reserved, and Sweetwater did not presume again along this line. Instead, he looked well at the books piled upon the shelves under these photographs, and wondered aloud at their number and at the man who could waste such a lot of time in reading them. But he made no more direct remarks. Was he cowed by the penetrating eye he encountered whenever he yielded to the fascination exerted by Mr. Brotherson's personality and looked his way? He hated to think so, yet something held him in check and made him listen, open-mouthed, when the other chose to speak. Yet there was one cheerful moment. It was when he noticed the careless way in which those books were arranged upon their shelves. An idea had come to him. He hid his relief in his cup as he drained the last drops of the coffee, which really tasted better than he had expected. When he returned from work that afternoon, it was with an auger under his coat and a conviction which led him to empty out the contents of a small file which he took down from a shelf. He had told Mr. Gryce that he was eager for the business because of its difficulties, but that was when he was feeling fine and up to any game which might come his way. Now he felt weak and easily discouraged. This would not do. He must regain his health at all hazards. So he poured out the mixture which had given him such a sickly air. This done, and a rude supper eaten, he took up his auger. He had heard Mr. Brotherson's step go by, but next minute he laid it down again in great haste and flung a newspaper over it. Mr. Brotherson was coming back, had stopped at his door, had knocked, and must be let in. "You're better this evening," he heard in those kindly tones which so confused and irritated him. "Yes," was the surly admission, "but it's stifling here. If I have to live long in this hole, I'll dry up from want of air. It's near the shop, or I wouldn't stay out the week." Twice this day he had seen Brotherson's tall figure stop before the window of this shop and look in at him at his bench, but he said nothing about that. "Yes," agreed the other, "it's no way to live. But you're alone. Upstairs there's the whole family huddled into a room just like this. 2 of the kids sleep in the closet. It's things like that which have made me the friend of the poor, and the mortal enemy of men and women who spread themselves over a dozen big rooms and think themselves ill-used if the gas burns poorly or a fireplace smokes. I'm off for the evening. Anything I can do for you?" "Show me how I can win my way into such rooms as you've just talked about. Nothing less will make me look up. I'd like to sleep in one tonight. In the best bedroom, sir. I'm ambitious, I am." A poor joke, though they both laughed. There Mr. Brotherson passed on, and Sweetwater listened till he was sure that his too attentive neighbour had really gone down the 3 flights between him and the street. Then he took up his auger again and shut himself up in his closet. There was nothing peculiar about this closet. It was just an ordinary one, with drawers and shelves on one side, and an open space on the other for the hanging up of clothes. Very few clothes hung there at present, but it was in this portion of the closet that he stopped, and began to try the wall of Brotherson's room with the butt end of the tool he carried. The sound seemed to satisfy him, for very soon he was boring a hole at a point exactly level with his ear, but not without frequent pauses and much attention given to the possible return of those departed footsteps. He remembered that Mr. Brotherson had a way of coming back on unexpected errands after giving out his intention of being absent for hours. Sweetwater did not want to be caught in any such trap as that, so he carefully followed every sound that reached him from the noisy halls. But he did not forsake his post. He did not have to. Mr. Brotherson had been sincere in his good-bye, and the auger finished its job and was withdrawn without any interruption from the man whose premises had been thus audaciously invaded. "Neat as well as useful," was the gay comment with which Sweetwater surveyed his work, then laid his ear to the hole. Whereas previously he could barely hear the rattling of coals from the coal scuttle, he was now able to catch the sound of an ash falling from the ash pit. His next move was to test the depth of the partition by inserting his finger in the hole he had made. He found it stopped by some obstacle before it had reached half its length, and anxious to satisfy himself of the nature of this obstacle, he gently moved the tip of his finger to and fro over what was certainly the edge of a book. This proved that his calculations had been correct, and that the opening, so accessible on his side, was completely veiled on the other by the books he had seen packed on the shelves. As these shelves had no other backing than the wall, he had feared striking a spot not covered by a book, but he had not undertaken so risky a piece of work without first noting how nearly the tops of the books approached the line of the shelf above them, and the consequent unlikelihood of his striking the space between, at the height he planned the hole. He had even been careful to assure himself that all the volumes at this exact point stood far enough forward to afford room behind them for the chips and plaster he must necessarily push through with his auger, and also, important consideration, for the free passage of the sounds by which he hoped to profit. As he listened for a moment longer, and then stooped to gather up the debris which had fallen on his own side of the partition, he muttered in his old self-congratulatory way, "If the devil don't interfere in some way best known to himself, this opportunity I have made for myself of listening to this arrogant fellow's very heartbeats should give me some clue to his secret. As soon as I can stand it, I'll spend my evenings at this hole." But it was days before he could trust himself so far. Meanwhile their acquaintance ripened, though with no very satisfactory results. The detective found himself led into telling stories of his early home life to keep pace with the man who had always something of moment and solid interest to impart. This was undesirable, for instead of calling out a corresponding confidence from Brotherson, it only seemed to make his conversation more coldly impersonal. In consequence, Sweetwater suddenly found himself quite well, and on one evening, when he was sure that his neighbour was at home, he slid softly into his closet and laid his ear to the opening he had made there. The result was unexpected. Mr. Brotherson was pacing the floor and talking softly to himself. At first the cadence and full music of the tones conveyed nothing to our far from literary detective. The victim of his secret machinations was expressing himself in words. Words. That was the point which counted with him, but as he listened longer and gradually took in the sense of these words, his heart went down lower and lower till it reached his boots. His inscrutable and ever disappointing neighbour was not indulging in self-communings of any kind. He was reciting poetry, and what was worse, poetry which he only half remembered and was trying to recall. An incredible occupation for a man weighted with a criminal secret. Sweetwater was disgusted, and was withdrawing in high indignation from his vantage point, when something occurred of a startling enough nature to hold him where he was in almost breathless expectation. The hole, which in the darkness of the closet was always faintly visible, even when the light was not very strong in the adjoining room, had suddenly become a bright and shining loophole, with a suggestion of movement in the space beyond. The book which had hid this hole on Brotherson's side had been taken down, the one book in all those hundreds whose removal threatened Sweetwater's schemes, if not himself. For an instant the thwarted detective listened for the angry shout or the smothered oath which would naturally follow the discovery by Brotherson of this attempted interference with his privacy. But all was still on his side of the wall. A rustling of leaves could be heard as the inventor searched for the poem he wanted, but nothing more. In withdrawing the book he had failed to notice the hole in the plaster back of it, but he could hardly fail to see it when he came to put the book back. Meantime, suspense for Sweetwater. It was several minutes before he heard Mr. Brotherson's voice again. Then it was in triumphant repetition of the lines which had escaped his memory. They were great words surely, and Sweetwater never forgot them, but the impression which they made upon his mind, an impression so forcible that he was able to repeat them months afterward to Mr. Gryce, did not prevent him from noting the tone in which they were uttered, nor the thud which followed as the book was thrown down upon the floor. "Fool!" The word rang out in bitter irony from his irate neighbour's lips. "What does he know of woman? Woman! Let him court a rich one and see! But that's all over and done with. No more harping on that string, and no more reading of poetry. I'll never—" The rest was lost in his throat, and was quite unintelligible to the anxious listener. Self-revealing words, which an instant before would have aroused Sweetwater's deepest interest, but they had suddenly lost all force for the unhappy listener. The sight of that hole still shining brightly before his eyes had distracted his thoughts and roused his liveliest apprehensions. If that book should be allowed to lie where it had fallen, then he was in for a period of uncertainty he shrank from contemplating. Any moment his neighbour might look up and catch sight of this hole bored in the backing of the shelves before him. Could the man who had been guilty of submitting him to this outrage stand the strain of waiting indefinitely for the moment of discovery? He doubted it if the suspense lasted too long. Shifting his position, he placed his eye where his ear had been. He could see very little. The space before him, limited as it was to the width of the one volume withdrawn, precluded his seeing aught but what lay directly before him. Happily, it was in this narrow line of vision that Mr. Brotherson stood. He had resumed work upon his model, and was so placed that while his face was not visible, his hands were, and as Sweetwater watched these hands and noticed the delicacy of their manipulation, he was enough of a workman to realize that work so fine called for an undivided attention. He need not fear the gaze shifting while those hands moved as warily as they did now. Relieved for the moment, he left his post and, sitting down on the edge of his cot, gave himself up to thought. He deserved this mischance. Had he profited properly by Mr. Gryce's teaching, he would not have been caught like this. He would have calculated not upon the 999 chances of that book being left alone, but upon the 1000th one of its being the very one to be singled out and removed. Had he done this, had he taken pains to so roughen and discolour the opening he had made that it would look like an ancient rat hole instead of showing a clean bore, he would have some answer to give Brotherson when he came to question him in regard to it. But now the whole thing seemed up. He had shown himself a fool, and by good rights ought to acknowledge his defeat and return to headquarters. But he had too much spirit for that. He would rather face the pistol he had once seen in his enemy's hand. Yet it was hard to sit here waiting. Suddenly he started upright. He would go meet his fate, be present in the room itself when the discovery was made which threatened to upset all his plans. He was not ashamed of his calling, and Brotherson would think twice before attacking him when once convinced that he had the department behind him. "Excuse me, comrade," were the words with which he endeavoured to account for his presence at Brotherson's door. My lamp smells so, and I've made such a mess of my work today that I've just stepped in for a chat. If I'm not wanted, say so. I don't want to bother you. But you do look pleasant here. I hope the thing I'm turning over in my head, every man has his schemes for making a fortune, you know, will be a success some day. I'd like a big room like this, and a lot of books, and pictures." Craning his neck, he took a peep at the shelves with an air of open admiration which effectually concealed his real purpose. What he wanted was to catch one glimpse of that empty space from his present standpoint, and he was both astonished and relieved to note how narrow and inconspicuous it looked. Certainly he had less to fear than he supposed, and when, upon Mr. Brotherson's invitation, he stepped into the room, it was with a dash of his former audacity which gave him, unfortunately perhaps, a quick, strong, and unexpected likeness to his old self. But if Brotherson noticed this, nothing in his manner gave proof of the fact. Though usually averse to visitors, especially when employed as at present on his precious model, he quite warmed toward his unexpected guest, and even led the way to where it stood uncovered on the table. "You find me at work," he remarked. "I don't suppose you understand any but your own?" "If you mean to ask if I understand what you're trying to do there, I'm free to say that I don't. I couldn't tell now offhand whether it's an airship you're planning, or a hydraulic machine, or He stopped with a laugh and turned toward the bookshelves. "Now, here's what I like. These books just take my eye." "Look at them, then. I like to see a man interested in books. Only, I thought if you knew how to handle wire, I would get you to hold this end while I work with the other." "I guess I know enough for that," was Sweetwater's gay rejoinder. But when he felt that communicating wire in his hand and experienced for the first time the full influence of the other's eye, it took all his hardihood to hide the hypnotic thrill it gave him. Though he smiled and chatted, he could not help asking himself between whiles what had killed the poor washerwoman across the court, and what had killed Miss Challoner. Something visible or something invisible? Something which gave warning of attack, or something which struck in silence? He found himself gazing long and earnestly at this man's hand, and wondering if death lay under it. It was a strong hand, a deft, clean-cut member, formed to respond to the slightest hint from the powerful brain controlling it. But was this its whole story? Had he said all when he had said this? Fascinated by the question, Sweetwater died 100 deaths in his awakened fancy, as he followed the sharp, short instructions which fell with cool precision from the other's lips. 100 steps, I say, but with no betrayal of his folly. The anxiety he showed was that of one eager to please, which may explain why on the conclusion of his task Mr. Brotherson gave him one of his infrequent smiles and remarked, as he buried the model under its cover, "You're handy, and you're quiet at your job. Who knows but that I shall want you again? Will you come if I call you?" "Won't I?" was the gay retort, as the detective thus released stooped for the book still lying on the floor. "Paolo and Francesca," he read from the back as he laid it on the table. "Poetry?" he queried. "Rot!" scornfully returned the other as he moved to take down a bottle and some glasses from a cupboard let into another portion of the wall. Sweetwater, taking advantage of the moment, sidled towards the shelf where that empty space still gaped with the tell-tale hole at the back. He could easily have replaced the missing book before Mr. Brotherson turned, but the issue was too doubtful. He was dealing with no absent-minded fool, and it behooved him to avoid above all things calling attention to the book, or to the place on the shelf where it belonged. But there was one thing he could do, and did. Reaching out a finger as deft as Brotherson's own, he pushed a second volume into the place of the one that was gone. This veiled the auger hole completely, a fact which so entirely relieved his mind that his old smile came back like sunshine to his lips, and it was only by a distinct effort that he kept the dancing humour from his eyes as he prepared to refuse the glass which Brotherson now brought forward. "None of that," he said. "You mustn't tempt me. The doctor has shut down all kinds of spirits for 2 months more, at least. But don't let me hinder you. I can bear to smell the stuff. My turn will come again some day." But Brotherson did not drink. Setting down the glass he carried, he took up the book lying near, weighed it in his hand, and laid it down again, with an air of thoughtful inquiry. Then he suddenly pushed it toward Sweetwater. "Do you want it?" he asked. Sweetwater was too taken aback to answer immediately. This was a move he did not understand. Want it? He? What he wanted was to see it put back in its place on the shelf. Did Brotherson suspect this? The supposition was incredible, yet who could read a mind so mysterious? Sweetwater, debating the subject, decided that the risk of adding to any such possible suspicion was less to be dreaded than the continued threat offered by that unoccupied space so near the hole, which testified so unmistakably of the means he had taken to spy upon the suspected man's privacy. So, after a moment of awkward silence, not out of keeping with the character he had assumed, he calmly refused the present as he had the glass. Unhappily he was not rewarded by seeing the despised volume restored to its shelf. It still lay where its owner had pushed it when, with some awkwardly muttered thanks, the discomfited detective withdrew to his own room. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 2, As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 18. What Am I to Do? Early morning saw Sweetwater peering into the depths of his closet. The hole was hardly visible. This meant that the book he had pushed across it from the other side had not been removed. Greatly reassured by the sight, he awaited his opportunity, and as soon as a suitable one presented itself, prepared the hole for inspection by breaking away its edges and begrimming it well with plaster and old dirt. This done, he left matters to arrange themselves, which they did after this manner. Mr. Brotherson suddenly developed a great need of him, and it became a common thing for him to spend the half and sometimes the whole of the evening in the neighbouring room. This was just what he had worked for, and his constant intercourse with the man whose secret he sought to surprise should have borne fruit. But it did not. Nothing in the eager but painstaking inventor showed a distracted mind or a heavily burdened soul. Indeed, he was so calm in all his ways, so precise and so self-contained, that Sweetwater often wondered what had become of the fiery agitator and eloquent propagandist of new and startling doctrines. Then he thought he understood the riddle. The model was reaching its completion, and Brotherson's extreme interest in it and the confidence he had in its success swallowed up all lesser emotions. Were the invention to prove a failure, but there was small hope of this. The man was of too well poised a mind to overestimate his work or miscalculate its place among modern improvements. Soon he would reach the goal of his desires. He praised, feted, made much of by the very people he now professedly scorned. There was no thoroughfare for Sweetwater here. Another road must be found, some secret, strange and unforeseen method of reaching a soul inaccessible to all ordinary or even extraordinary impressions. Would a night of thought reveal such a method? Night? The very word brought inspiration. A man is not his full self at night. Secrets which, under the ordinary circumstances of everyday life, lie too deep for surprise, creep from their hiding places in the dismal hours of universal quiet, and lips which are dumb to the most subtle of questionnaires break into strange and self-revealing mutterings when sleep lies heavy on ear and eye, and the forces of life and death are released to play with the rudderless spirit. It was in different words from these that Sweetwater reasoned, no doubt, but his conclusions were the same, and as he continued to brood over them, he saw a chance, a fool's chance, possibly. But fools sometimes win where wise men fail. Of reaching these depths he still believed in, notwithstanding his failure to sound them. Addressing a letter to his friend in 29th Street, he awaited reply in the shape of a small package he had ordered sent to the corner drug store. When it came, he carried it home in a state of mingled hope and misgiving. Was he about to cap his fortnight of disappointment by another signal failure, end the matter by disclosing his hand, lose all, or win all by an experiment as daring and possibly as fanciful as were his continued suspicions of this seemingly upright and undoubtedly busy man? He made no attempt to argue the question. The event called for the exercise of the most dogged elements in his character, and upon these he must rely. He would make the effort, he contemplated, simply because he was minded to do so. That was all there was to it. But anyone noting him well that night would have seen that he ate little and consulted his watch continually. Sweetwater had not yet passed the line where work becomes routine and the feelings remain totally under control. Brotherson was unusually active and alert that evening. He was anxious to fit one delicate bit of mechanism into another, and he was continually interrupted by visitors. Some big event was on the socialistic world, and his presence was eagerly demanded by one brotherhood after another. Sweetwater, posted at his loophole, heard the arguments advanced by each separate spokesman, followed by Brotherson's unvarying reply, that when his work was done, and he had proved his right to approach them with a message, they might look to hear from him again, but not before. His patience was inexhaustible, but he showed himself relieved when the hour grew too late for further interruption. He began to whistle, a token that all was going well with him, and Sweetwater, who had come to understand some of his moods, looked forward to an hour or two of continuous work on Brotherson's part and of dreary and impatient waiting on his own. But, as so many times before, he misread the man. Earlier than common, much earlier. In fact, Mr. Brotherson laid down his tools and gave himself up to a restless pacing of the floor. This was not usual with him, nor did he often indulge himself in playing on the piano as he did tonight, beginning with a few heavenly strains and ending with a bang that made the keyboard jump. Certainly something was amiss in the quarter where peace had hitherto reigned undisturbed. Had the depths begun to heave, or were physical causes alone responsible for these unwonted ebullitions of feeling? The question was immaterial. Either would form an excellent preparation for the coup planned by Sweetwater, and when, after an hour of uncertainty, perfect silence greeted him from his neighbour's room, hope had soared again on exultant wing, far above all former discouragements. Mr. Brotherson's bed was in a remote corner from the loophole made by Sweetwater, but in the stillness now pervading the whole building, the latter could hear his even breathing very distinctly. He was in a deep sleep. The young detective's moment had come. Taking from his breast a small box, he placed it on a shelf close against the partition. An instant of quiet listening, then he touched a spring in the side of the box and laid his ear, in haste, to his loophole. A strain of well-known music broke softly from the box and sent its vibrations through the wall. It was answered instantly by a stir within. Then, as the noble air continued, awakening memories of that fatal instant when it crashed through the corridors of the Hotel Clermont, drowning Miss Challoner's cry, if not the sound of her fall. A word burst from the sleeping man's lips, which carried its own message to the listening detective. It was Edith, Miss Challoner's first name, and the tone bespoke a shaken soul. Sweetwater, gasping with excitement, caught the box from the shelf and silenced it. It had done its work, and it was no part of Sweetwater's plan to have this strain located, or even to be thought real. But its echo still lingered in Brotherson's otherwise unconscious ears, for another "Edith" escaped his lips, followed by a smothered but forceful utterance of these 5 words: "You know I promised you." Promised her what? He did not say. Would he have done so had the music lasted a trifle longer? Would he yet complete his sentence? Sweetwater trembled with eagerness, and listened breathlessly for the next sound. Brotherson was awake. He was tossing in his bed. Now he has leaped to the floor. Sweetwater hears him groan. Then comes another silence, broken at last by the sound of his body falling back upon the bed, and the troubled ejaculation of "Good God!" wrung from his lips. No torture could have forced into complaint under any daytime conditions. Sweetwater continued to listen, but he had heard all, and after some minutes longer of fruitless waiting, he withdrew from his post. The episode was over. He would hear no more that night. Was he satisfied? Certainly the event, puerile as it might seem to some, had opened up strange vistas to his aroused imagination. The words, "Edith, you know I promised you," were in themselves provocative of strange and doubtful conjectures. Had the sleeper, under the influence of a strain of music indissolubly associated with the death of Miss Challoner, been so completely forced back into the circumstances and environment of that moment that his mind had taken up his lips, repeated the thoughts with which that moment of horror was charged? Sweetwater imagined the scene, saw the figure of Brotherson hesitating at the top of the stairs, saw hers advancing from the writing room, with startled and uplifted hand heard the music, the crash of that great finale, and decided, without hesitation, that the words he had just heard were indeed the thoughts of that moment. "Edith, you know I promised you." What had he promised? What she received was death. Had this been in his mind? Would this have been the termination of the sentence had he wakened less soon to consciousness and caution? Sweetwater dared to believe it. He was no nearer comprehending the mystery it involved than he had been before, but he felt sure that he had been given one true and positive glimpse into this harassed soul, which showed its deeply hidden secret to be both deadly and fearsome. And happy to have won his way so far into the mystic labyrinth he had sworn to pierce, he rested in happy unconsciousness till morning, when— Could it be? Was it he who was dreaming now, or was the event of the night a mere farce of his own imagining? Mr. Brotherson was whistling in his room, gaily and with ever-increasing verve, and the tune which filled the whole floor with music was the same grand finale from William Tell, which had seemed to work such magic in the night. As Sweetwater caught the mellow but indifferent notes sounding from those lips of brass, he dragged forth the music box he held hidden in his coat pocket, and flinging it on the floor, stamped upon it. "The man is too strong for me," he cried. "His heart is granite. He meets my every move. What am I to do now? End of chapter 18.
Of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 2, as seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 19, The Danger Moment. For a day, Sweetwater acknowledged himself to be mentally crushed, disillusioned, and defeated. Then his spirits regained their poise. It would take a heavy weight indeed to keep them down permanently. His opinion was not changed in regard to his neighbor's secret guilt. A demeanor of this sort suggested bravado rather than bravery to the ever-suspicious detective. But he saw very plainly by this time that he would have to employ more subtle methods, yet ere his hand would touch the goal which so tantalizingly eluded him. His work at the bench suffered that week. He made 2 mistakes. But by Saturday night he had satisfied himself that he had reached the point where he would be justified in making use of Miss Chandler's letters. So he telephoned his wishes to New York, and awaited the promised developments with an anxiety we can only understand by realizing how much greater were his chances of failure than of success. To ensure the latter, every factor in his scheme must work to perfection. The medium of communication, a young, untried girl, must do her part with all the skill of artist and author combined. Would she disappoint them? He did not think so. Women possess a marvelous adaptability for this kind of work, and this one was French, which made the case still more hopeful. But Brotherson, in what spirit would he meet the proposed advances? Would he even admit the girl? And if he did, would the interview bear any such fruit as Sweetwater hoped for? The man who could mock the terrors of the night by a careless repetition of a straying instinct with the most sacred memories was not to be depended upon to show much feeling at sight of a departed woman's writing. But no other hope remained, and Sweetwater faced the attempt with heroic determination. The day was Sunday, which ensured Brotherson's being at home. Nothing would have lured Sweetwater out for a moment, though he had no reason to expect that the affair he was anticipating would come off till early evening. But it did. Late in the afternoon he heard the expected steps go by his door, a woman's steps. But they were not alone. A man's accompanied them. What man? Sweetwater hastened to satisfy himself on this point by laying his ear to the partition. Instantly the whole conversation became audible. "An errand? Oh, yes, I have an errand," explained the evidently unwelcome intruder, in her broken English. "This is my brother Pierre. My name is Celeste Ledru. I understand English very well. I have worked much in families, but he understands nothing. He is all French. He accompanies me for the, what you call it, les convenances. He knows nothing of this business." Sweetwater, in the darkness of his closet, laughed in his gleeful appreciation. "Great," was his comment, "just great. She has thought of everything, or Mr. Gryce has." Meanwhile the girl was proceeding with increased volubility. "What is this business, monsieur? I have something to sell, so you Americans speak. Something you will want much, very sacred, very precious. A souvenir from the tomb, monsieur. Will you give 10? No, that is too little. $15 for it? It is worth, more, much more to the true lover. Pierre, tu es best. Tends-toi droit to the sachets. Monsieur Brotherson est un monsieur comme il faut." This adjuration, uttered in sharp reprimand, and with but little of the French grace, may or may not have been understood by the unsympathetic man they were meant to impress. But the name which accompanied them, his own name, never heard but once before in this house, undoubtedly caused a silence which almost reached the point of embarrassment before he broke it with a harsh remark. "Your French may be good, but it does not go with me. Yet it is more intelligible than your English. What do you want here? What have you in that bag you wish to open, and what do you mean by this sentimental trash with which you offer it?" "Ah, monsieur has not memory of me," came in the sweetest tones of a really seductive voice. "You astonish me, monsieur. I thought you knew. Everybody else does. Oh, tout le monde, monsieur, that I was Miss Challoner's maid, near her when people were not, near her the very day she died." A pause, then an angry exclamation from someone. Sweetwater thought from the brother, who may have misinterpreted some look or gesture on Brotherson's part. Brotherson himself would not be apt to show surprise in any such noisy way. "I saw many things, oh, many things." The girl proceeded with an admirable mixture of suggestion and reserve. "That day, and other days too. She did not talk. Oh, no, she did not talk, but I saw. Oh, yes, I saw that you, I have to say it, monsieur, that you were très bon ami after that week in Lennox." "Well?" His utterance of this word was vigorous, but not tender. "What are you coming to? What can you have to show me in this connection that I will believe in for a moment?" "I have this. Is monsieur certain that no one can hear? I wouldn't have anybody hear what I have to tell you, for the world, for all the world." "No one can overhear." For the first time that day Sweetwater breathed a full, deep breath. This assurance had sounded heartfelt. Blessings on her cunning young head, she thinks of everything. "You are unhappy. You have thought Miss Challoner cold, that she had no response for your very ardent passion. But," these words were uttered sotto voice, and with telling pauses, "but I know very much better than that. She was very proud. She had a right. She was no poor girl like me, but she spent hours, hours in writing letters. She never sent. I saw one just once, for a little minute, while you could breathe so short as that, and began with Cherie, or your English for that, and ended with words, oh, very much like these. You may never see these lines, which was very interesting, very so, and made one want to see what she did with letters she wrote, and never mail. So I watch and look, and one day I see them. She had a little ivory box, oh, very nice, very pretty. I thought it was jewels she kept locked up so tight. But no, no, no. It was letters, these letters. I heard them rattle, rattle, not once, but many times. You believe me, monsieur?" "I believe you have taken every advantage possible to spy upon your mistress. I believe that. Yes." "From interest, monsieur, from great interest." "Self-interest?" "As monsieur pleases. But it was strange, very strange for a grande dame like that to write letters, sheets on sheets, and then not send them. Never. I dreamed of those letters. I could not help it, no? And when she died so quick, with no word from anyone, no word at all, I thought of those writings so secret, so of the heart. And when no one noticed, or thought about this box, or the key she kept shut tight, oh, always tight in her little gold purse. Ah, monsieur, do you want to see those letters?" asked the girl with a gulp. Evidently his appearance frightened her, or had her acting reached this point of extreme finish. "I had never a chance to put them back, and they belong to monsieur. They are his, all his, and so beautiful. Ah, just like poetry." "I don't consider them mine. I haven't a particle of confidence in you or in your story. You are a thief, self-convicted, or you're an agent of the police whose motives I neither understand nor care to investigate. Take up your bag and go. I haven't a cent's worth of interest in its contents." She started to her feet. Sweetwater heard her chair grate on the painted floor as she pushed it back in rising. The brother rose too, but more calmly. Brotherson did not stir. Sweetwater felt his hopes rapidly dying down, down into ashes, when suddenly her voice broke forth in pants. "And Marie said, everybody said, that you loved our great lady, that you, of the people common, common, working with the hands, living with men and women, working with the hands, that you had soul, sentiment, what you will of the good and the great, and that you would give your eyes for her words, si fine, si spirituelle, so like the verse de poet. False, false, all false. She was an angel. You are. Read that! She vehemently broke in, opening her bag and whisking a paper down before him. Read, and understand, my proud and lovely lady. She the right to die. You are hard, hard. You would have killed her if she had not. Silence, woman! I will read nothing! Came hissing from the strong man's teeth, set in an almost ungovernable anger. Take back this letter, as you call it, and leave my room. Never! You will not read? But you shall, you shall. Behold another. 1, 2, 3, 4. Madly they flew from her hand. Madly she continued her vituperative attack. Beast! Beast! That she should pour out her innocent heart to you, you! I do not want your money, monsieur of the common street, of the common house. It would be dirt. Pierre, it would be dirt. Ah, bah! Je m'oublie tout fait. Pierre est le bête. Il refuse de le toucher. Mais il faut qu'il le touche. C'est juste les aises de la plancher. Va-t'en. Je me moque de lui. Cagné! L'homme de peuple. Tout à fait le people. A loud slam, the scurrying of feet through the hall, accompanied by the slower and heavier tread of the so-called brother, then silence, and such silence that Sweetwater fancied he could catch the sound of Brotherson's heavy breathing. His own was silenced to a gasp. What a treasure of a girl! How natural her indignation! What an instinct she showed, and what comprehension! This high and mighty handling of a most difficult situation and a most difficult man had imposed on Brotherson, had almost imposed upon himself. Those letters so beautiful, so spirituelle. Yet the odds were that she had never read them, much less abstracted them. The minx! The ready, resourceful, wily, daring minx! But had she imposed on Brotherson? As the silence continued, Sweetwater began to doubt. He understood quite well the importance of his neighbour's first movement. Were he to tear those letters into shreds, he might be thus tempted. All depended on the strength of his present mood and the real nature of the secret which lay buried in his heart. Was that a heart as flinty as it seemed? Was there no place for doubt, or even for curiosity in its impenetrable depths? Seemingly he had not moved foot or hand since his unwelcome visitors had left. He was doubtless still staring at the scattered sheets lying before him, possibly battling with unaccustomed impulses, possibly weighing deeds and consequences in those slow-moving scales of his in which no man could cast a weight with any certainty how far its even balance would be disturbed. There was a sound of settling coal. Only at night would one expect to hear so slight a sound as that in a tenement full of noisy children. But the moment chanced to be propitious, and it not only attracted the attention of Sweetwater on his side of the wall, but it struck the ear of Brotherson also. With an ejaculation as bitter as it was impatient, he roused himself and gathered up the letters. Sweetwater could hear the successive rustlings as he bundled them up in his hand. Then came another silence. Then the lifting of a stove lid. Sweetwater had not been wrong in his secret apprehension. His identification with his unimpressionable neighbour's mood had shown him what to expect. These letters, these innocent and precious outpourings of a rare and womanly soul, the only conceivable open sesame to the hard-locked nature he found himself pitted against, would soon be resolved into a vanishing puff of smoke. But the lid was thrust back, and the letters remained in hand. Mortal strength had its limits. Even Brotherson could not shut down that lid on words which might have been meant for him, harshly as he had repelled the idea. The pause which followed told little, but when Sweetwater heard the man within move with characteristic energy to the door, turn the key and step back again to his place at the table, he knew that the danger moment had passed, and that those letters were about to be read, not casually, but seriously, as indeed their contents merited. This caused Sweetwater to feel serious himself. Upon what results might he calculate? What would happen to this hardy soul when the fact he so scornfully repudiated was borne in upon him, and he saw that the disdain which had antagonized him was a mere device, a cloak to hide the secret heart of love and eager womanly devotion. Her death, little as Brotherson would believe it up till now, had been his personal loss the greatest which can befall a man. When he came to see this, when the modest fervour of her unusual nature began to dawn upon him in these self-revelations, would the result be remorse, or just the deadening and final extinction of whatever tenderness he may have retained for her memory? Impossible to tell. The balance of probability hung even. Sweetwater recognized this, and clung, breathless, to his loophole. Fain would he have seen, as well as heard. Mr. Brotherson read the first letter standing. As it soon became public property, I will give it here, just as it afterwards appeared in the columns of the greedy journals. Beloved, when I sit, as I often do, in perfect quiet under the stars, and dream that you are looking at them too, not for hours, as I do, but for one full moment in which your thoughts are with me as wholly as mine are with you, I feel that the bond between us, unseen by the world, and possibly not wholly recognized by ourselves, is instinct with the same power which links together the eternities. It seems to have always been, to have known no beginning, only a budding and a florescence, the visible product of a hidden but always present reality. A month ago, and I was ignorant even of your name. Now you seem the best known to me, the best understood of God's creatures. One afternoon of perfect companionship, one flash of strong emotion with its deep, true insight into each other's soul, and the miracle was wrought. We had met, and henceforth parting would mean separation only, and not the severing of a mutual bond. One hand, and one only, could do that now. I will not name that hand. For us there is naught ahead but life. Thus do I ease my heart in the silence which conditions impose upon us. Some day I shall hear your voice again, and then... The paper dropped from the reader's hand. It was several minutes before he took up another. This one, as it happened, antedated the other, as will appear on reading. My friend, I said that I could not write to you, that we must wait. You were willing, but there is much to be accomplished, and the silence may be long. My father is not an easy man to please, but he desires my happiness, and will listen to my plea when the right hour comes. When you have won your place, when you have shown yourself to be the man I feel you to be, then my father will recognize your worth, and the way will be cleared, despite the obstacles which now intervene. But meantime, you will not know it, but words will rise, the heart must find utterance. What the lip cannot utter, nor the looks reveal, these pages shall hold in sacred trust for you, till the day when my father will place my hand in yours with heartfelt approval. Is it a folly, a woman's weak evasion of the strong silence of man? You must say so some day, but somehow I doubt it. I doubt it. The creaking of a chair. The man within had seated himself. There was no other sound. A soul in turmoil wakens no echoes. Sweetwater envied the walls surrounding the unsympathetic reader. They could see. He could only listen. A little while, then that slight rustling again of the unfolding sheet. The following was read, and then the fourth and last. Dearest, did you think I had never seen you till that day we met in Lenox? I am going to tell you a secret, a great, great secret, such a one as a woman hardly whispers to her own heart. One day, in early summer, I was sitting in St. Bartholomew's Church on Fifth Avenue, waiting for the services to begin. It was early, and the congregation was assembling. While idly watching the people coming in, I saw a gentleman pass by me up the aisle, who made me forget all the others. He had not the air of a New Yorker. He was not even dressed in city style, but as I noted his face and expression, I said way down in my heart, that is the kind of man I could love. The only man I have ever seen who could make me forget my own world and my own people. It was a passing thought, soon forgotten, but when in that hour of embarrassment and peril on Greylock Mountain I looked up into the face of my rescuer, and saw again that countenance which so short a time before had called into life impulses till then utterly unknown. I knew that my hour was come, and that was why my confidence was so spontaneous, and my belief in the future so absolute. I trust your love which will work wonders, and I trust my own, which sprang at a look, but only gathered strength and permanence when I found that the soul of the man I love bettered his outward attractions, making the ideal of my foolish girlhood seem as unsubstantial and evanescent as a dream in the glowing noontide. My own, I can say so now, for you have written to me, and I have the dancing words with which to silence any unsought doubt which might subdue the exuberance of these secret outpourings. I did not expect this. I thought that you would remain as silent as myself. But men's ways are not our ways. They cannot exhaust longing in purposeless words on scraps of soulless paper, and I am glad that they cannot. I love you for your impatience, for your purpose, and for the manliness which will win for you yet all that you covet of fame, accomplishment, and love. You expect no reply, but there are ways in which one can keep silent and yet speak. Won't you be surprised when your answer comes in a manner you have never thought of? End of chapter 19. Recording by Acacia Wood.
Chapter 20 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 2. As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 20. Confusion. In his interest in what was going on the other side of the wall, Sweetwater had forgotten himself. Daylight had declined, but in the darkness of the closet this change had passed unheeded. Night itself might come, but that should not force him to leave his post, so long as his neighbour remained behind his locked door, brooding over the words of love and devotion which had come to him, as it were from the other world. But was he brooding? That sound of iron clattering upon iron, that smothered exclamation and the laugh which ended it. Anger and determination rang in that laugh. It had a hideous sound which prepared Sweetwater for the smell which now reached his nostrils. The letters were burning. This time the lid had been lifted from the stove with unrelenting purpose. Poor Edith Challoner's touching words had met a different fate from any which she, in her ignorance of this man's nature, a nature to which she had ascribed untold perfections, could possibly have conceived. As Sweetwater thought of this, he stirred nervously in the darkness, and broke into silent invective against the man who could so insult the memory of one who had perished under the blight of his own coldness and misunderstanding. Then he suddenly started back surprised and apprehensive. Brotherson had unlocked his door and was coming rapidly his way. Sweetwater heard his step in the hall, and had hardly time to bound from his closet, when he saw his own door burst in and found himself face to face with his redoubtable neighbour, in a state of such rage as few men could meet without quailing, even were they of his own stature, physical vigour and prowess, and Sweetwater was a small man. However, disappointment such as he had just experienced brings with it a desperation which often outdoes courage, and the detective, smiling with an air of gay surprise, shouted out: "Well, what's the matter now? Has the machine busted, or tumbled into the fire, or sailed away? to lands unknown out of your open window?" "You were coming out of that closet," was the fierce rejoinder. "What have you got there? Something which concerns me, or why should your face go pale at my presence, and your forehead drip with sweat? Don't think that you've deceived me for a moment as to your business here. I recognized you immediately. You played the stranger well, but you've a nose and an eye nobody could forget. I have known all along that I had a police spy for a neighbour, but it didn't faze me. I've nothing to conceal, and wouldn't mind a regiment of you fellows, if you'd only play a straight game. But when it comes to foisting upon me a parcel of letters to which I have no right, and then setting a fellow like you to count my groans or whatever else they expected to hear, I have a right to defend myself, and defend myself I will, by God. But first, let me be sure that my accusations will stand. Come into this closet with me. It abuts on the wall of my room and has its own secret, I know. What is it? I have you at an advantage now, and you shall tell." He did have Sweetwater at an advantage, and the detective knew it and disdained a struggle which would have only called up a crowd, friendly to the other but inimical to himself. Allowing Brotherson to drag him into the closet, he stood quiescent, while the determined man who held him with one hand felt about with the other over the shelves and along the partitions till he came to the hole which had offered such a happy means of communication between the two rooms. Then, with a laugh almost as bitter in tone as that which rang from Brotherson's lips, he acknowledged that business had its necessities and that apologies from him were in order, adding, as they both stepped out into the rapidly darkening room, "We've played about, we two, and you've come out ahead. Allow me to congratulate you, Mr. Brotherson. You've cleared yourself so far as I am concerned. I leave this ranch tonight." The frown had come back to the forehead of the indignant man who confronted him. "So you listened," he cried. "Listened when you weren't sneaking under my eye. A fine occupation for a man who can dovetail a corner like an adept. I wish I had let you join the brotherhood you were good enough to mention. They would know how to appreciate your double gifts and how to reward your excellence in the one, if not in the other. What did the police expect to learn about me that should consider it necessary to call into exercise such extraordinary talents?" "I'm not good at conundrums. I was given a task to perform, and I performed it," was Sweetwater's sturdy reply. Then slowly, with his eye fixed directly upon his antagonist, "I guess they thought you a man. And so did I until I heard you burn those letters. Fortunately we have copies." "Letters!" Fury thickened the speaker's voice, and lent a savage gleam to his eye. "Forgeries! Make-believes! Miss Challoner never wrote the drivel you dare to designate as letters. It was concocted at police headquarters. They made me tell my story, and then they found someone who could wield the poetic pen. I'm obliged to them for the confidence they show in my credulity. I credit Miss Challoner with such words as have been given me to read here today. I knew the lady, and I know myself. Nothing that passed between us, not an event in which we were both concerned, has been forgotten by me, and no feature of our intercourse fits the language you have ascribed to her. On the contrary, there is a lamentable contradiction between facts as they were and the fancies you have made her indulge in, and this, as you must acknowledge, not only proves their falsity, but exonerate Miss Challoner from all possible charge of sentimentality. Yet she certainly wrote those letters. We had them from Mr. Challoner. The woman who brought them was really her maid. We have not deceived you in this. I do not believe you." It was not offensively said, but the conviction it expressed was absolute. Sweetwater recognized the tone as one of truth, and inwardly laid down his arms. He could never like the man, there was too much iron in his fibre, but he had to acknowledge that as a foe he was invulnerable and therefore admirable to one who had the good sense to appreciate him. "I do not want to believe you," thus did Brotherson supplement his former sentence, "for if I were to attribute those letters to her, I would have to acknowledge that they were written to another man than myself, and this would be anything but agreeable to me. Now I am going to my room and to my work. You may spend the rest of the evening or the whole night, if you will, listening at that hole. As heretofore, the labour will be all yours, and the indifference mine." With a satirical play of feature which could hardly be called a smile, he nodded and left the room. Chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 2, As Seen by Detective Sweetwater. Chapter 21. A Change. "It's all up. I'm beaten on my own ground," thus confessed Sweetwater in great dejection to himself. "But I'm going to take advantage of the permission he's just given me and continue the listening act. Just because he told me to, and just because he thinks I won't. I'm sure it's no worse than to spend hours of restless tossing in bed, trying to sleep." But our young detective did neither. As he was putting his supper dishes away, a messenger boy knocked at his door and handed him a note. It was from Mr. Grease, and ran thus: "Steal off if you can, and as soon as you can, and meet me in 29th Street. A discovery has been made which alters the whole situation." End of Book 2, Chapter 21. Recording by Logan McCammon.